Ed Gein didn't become America's most disturbing killer overnight. His mother spent 39 years creating a monster. And even today, psychologists struggle to fully understand what she did to him. You might have seen Netflix's new series, Monster, the Ed Gein story. It shows the crimes. It shows the horror. But it barely touches the real story, the childhood that created this killer. Today, we're going deeper than Netflix ever did. My dear friend, before we jump into this tragic story, I need to ask something important. Please hit the like button right now. Subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who cares about understanding how childhood trauma creates dangerous adults. Why am I asking? Because every single share reaches more people who might recognize these warning signs. People who might be able to protect a child before it's too late. This isn't just entertainment. This is education that could save lives. Do me one more favor. In the comments below, write your city and what time you're watching this. It sounds simple, but it helps me understand when to publish these investigations so they reach the maximum number of people. The more people who see this, the more children we can potentially help. My channel exists to bring you stories about children who desperately needed protection but didn't get it. Children like Ed Gein. Each investigation I do isn't just a story about tragedy. It's a lesson in recognizing dangerous situations before they destroy a life. After this video, watch the other stories on this channel, because knowing about one case of child abuse isn't enough. You need to understand the patterns, the warning signs, the red flags that appear again and again. By the end of this video, you'll understand something disturbing. Ed Gein killed people. Ed Gein did horrible things. But experts agree his mother, Augusta, was the real monster. She didn't just influence her son's crimes. She engineered every single one of them through decades of psychological torture. Let's begin. So who was Ed Gein? If you don't know the name, you definitely know his legacy. Ed Gein was a killer who operated in rural Wisconsin in the 1950s. He was arrested in 1957, and what police found changed American horror forever. Ed Gein was officially convicted of 2 murders. The first victim was Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who disappeared in 1954. The second was Bernice Warden, a hardware store owner who vanished in November 1957. It was Bernice's disappearance that finally led police to Ed's farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin. What they found inside that farmhouse is almost impossible to believe. I'm going to tell you, but understand, this is disturbing. Police discovered furniture made from human skin, bowls crafted from human skulls, masks made from real human faces, a belt made of human nipples, lampshades covered in human flesh. This wasn't just murder. This was something psychologists had never seen before at this scale. Ed Gein had been digging up graves in local cemeteries and bringing bodies back to his farm. He was creating a collection, and every single piece had a purpose we'll discuss later in this video. Now here's why Ed Gein matters to you, even if you've never heard his name. Every horror movie villain you've ever been scared of, most of them came from Ed Gein. Norman Bates from Psycho, the man who dresses as his dead mother and kills people, that's based on Ed Gein. Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the killer who wears human skin masks, that's Ed Gein. Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, the murderer who makes a suit from women's skin, Ed Gein again. Netflix just released their series, Monster, the Ed Gein story, in October 2024. Millions of people watched it. They saw the crimes. They saw the horror. They saw the trial. But here's what frustrated me about that Netflix series. They spent maybe 10 minutes on his childhood. 10 minutes trying to explain 39 years of psychological destruction. That's not enough. Not even close. Because here's what everyone asks. How does a human being do this? How does someone look at another person and see raw material? How does a man become so disconnected from reality that he turns human bodies into household objects? The answer isn't in the crimes. The answer is in the childhood. And that's exactly what Netflix's Ed Gein series rushed past. Ed Gein wasn't born a monster. In fact, people who knew him as a child described him as quiet, polite, even gentle. His teachers said he was a good student. His neighbors said he was helpful and kind. So what happened? One word. Augusta. Augusta Gein. Ed's mother. And according to every forensic psychologist who has studied this case, she is the real architect of these crimes. Netflix showed you Augusta as a strict religious woman. They showed her reading the Bible. They showed her keeping Ed isolated. But they didn't show you the systematic psychological torture that happened every single day for 39 years inside that farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin. They didn't explain how she weaponized religion to destroy his understanding of women. They didn't detail how she used isolation to prevent him from developing any normal social skills. They didn't reveal how every single victim Ed chose looked exactly like her. That's what we're doing today. We're going back to the beginning, back to that farmhouse, back to a little boy who never had a chance. Because if you want to understand the horror Ed Gein created, you first need to understand the horror that created Ed Gein. And I promise you, what his mother did to him is more disturbing than anything you saw in that Netflix series. Let's meet Augusta Gein. Now let me introduce you to Augusta Wilhelmina Gein. Born in 1878, she grew up as a devout Lutheran in a strict religious community. And from a very young age, Augusta believed the world was filled with sin, temptation, and evil, especially when it came to women. In 1899, Augusta married George Gein, and this marriage became the lens through which she saw everything. George was an alcoholic. He was weak. He couldn't hold a job. He failed as a provider. And Augusta blamed herself for marrying him. But here's the critical part. She didn't just see her marriage as a mistake. She saw it as divine punishment. God was punishing her for giving in to desire, for being attracted to a man, for having sexual feelings. In her mind, her entire miserable life was proof that women who feel desire are destroyed by it. So Augusta developed a belief system that would eventually destroy her son. She became convinced that all women, every single woman except herself, were vessels of sin, instruments of the devil, prostitutes in spirit, if not in practice. She preached this constantly, every single day, and her two sons, Henry and Ed, were her captive audience. Let me describe what daily life looked like in the Gein household. Every morning and every evening, Augusta forced her sons to sit for Bible readings, but these weren't normal Bible readings. She didn't read about love, forgiveness, or redemption. She read exclusively about damnation, about sexual sin, about prostitutes and immoral women. She would make Ed read passages from the book of Proverbs about the strange woman whose house is the way to hell. She'd make him read from Revelation about the whore of Babylon. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, and after each reading, she would tell Ed directly, "Women will destroy you. All women are evil. They will drag you to hell. You must never trust them. You must never touch them. You must never desire them." Imagine being a child and hearing this every single day. Not once, not occasionally, every single day. But Augusta didn't stop at psychological control. She needed physical control too. And in 1914, when Ed was just 8 years old, she made a calculated decision. She moved the entire family to a remote 160-acre farm outside Plainfield, Wisconsin. Why? She told people it was for farming, but the real reason was isolation. The farmhouse was miles from the nearest neighbor, miles from town, miles from any other human contact. Augusta had created a prison, and Ed was her prisoner. At school, Ed tried to make friends. He was a gentle kid, polite, quiet. Other children would invite him to play. Teachers would encourage him to join activities. Augusta forbade all of it. No friends, no play dates, no school clubs, no sports. No social activities of any kind. Ed was to come straight home after school, do his chores, and sit for Bible study. When other parents invited Ed to birthday parties, Augusta would tell them no. When teachers asked why Ed couldn't participate in school events, she'd say he had farm work. But the truth was simpler and darker. She couldn't control what Ed might learn from other people. She couldn't control what other children might teach him about normal families, about normal mothers, about normal relationships between parents and children. Now here's where it gets even more disturbing. In most families, children have their own bedrooms, their own space, their own privacy. This is normal childhood development. This is how children learn to become independent people. Augusta refused to allow this. She made Ed sleep in her bedroom, not nearby, not in the next room, in her bedroom. And this continued into his teenage years, into his 20s, into his 30s. Think about what this does to a developing mind. Ed never had privacy. He never had independence. He never had a single moment where he existed as a separate person from his mother. Psychologists call this enmeshment. It's when a parent refuses to allow a child to develop their own identity. The child becomes an extension of the parent. They have no thoughts that aren't the parent's thoughts, no beliefs that aren't the parent's beliefs, no existence that isn't defined by the parent. Ed Gein never developed a self. He was simply an extension of Augusta. Her beliefs became his beliefs. Her hatred of women became his hatred of women. Her obsession with sin and damnation became his obsession. Where was George during all of this? Ed's father was there physically, but he was absent in every way that mattered. He drank. He disappeared for days. And when he was home, Augusta treated him with open contempt. Ed watched his mother dominate his father completely. He watched her call George weak, sinful, and worthless. And he learned a lesson. Men are powerless. Women, or at least his mother, hold all the power. Years later, after his arrest, Ed Gein was interviewed by psychologists. They asked him about his mother. And here's what he said, and I quote directly. "She was a good woman. She had to be obeyed. Read that again. She had to be obeyed. Not, I loved her. Not, I respected her. She had to be obeyed, like a law of nature, like gravity, like something that wasn't even a choice. So let's be clear about what Augusta Gein did. She didn't just raise her son strictly. She didn't just have strong religious beliefs. She systematically destroyed his ability to function as a normal human being. She isolated him from all social contact. She filled his mind with hatred and fear of women. She prevented him from developing any identity separate from her. She made herself the center of his entire universe. And she did this deliberately, consistently, for 39 years. Augusta Gein died in 1945. Ed was 39 years old. And for the first time in his entire life, he was alone. No mother to obey, no voice telling him what to think, no identity except the one she had created. What happened next is what happens when a person with no self, no social skills, and a mind filled with twisted beliefs about women suddenly has to exist in the world alone. Let's talk about what Augusta's death did to Ed. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, and from the very first day of his life, he was unwanted. Augusta already had one son, Henry, born 7 years earlier. She didn't want another child. She saw Ed's birth as another punishment from God, another consequence of her sinful marriage. And Ed knew it. Children always know when they're not wanted. Augusta made no effort to hide her preference for Henry. Henry was the firstborn. Henry was stronger. Henry was more useful on the farm. Ed was just there, an afterthought, a burden. Now let's talk about George Gein, Ed's father. George was a violent alcoholic who couldn't keep a job. He'd disappear for days on drinking binges. When he came home, he'd be drunk, angry, and sometimes violent. But here's what made it worse for Ed. Augusta didn't protect her sons from George's violence. Instead, she used it as a teaching tool. She would tell Ed and Henry, "Look at your father. This is what happens to weak men. This is what happens when you give in to sin and temptation." She taught her sons to despise their own father, to see him as less than human. And Ed watched his mother destroy his father's dignity every single day. The verbal abuse was constant. She called George worthless, pathetic, a failure, and she did this in front of her children. Ed's older brother Henry was different from the rest of the family. As Henry got older, he started to see what Augusta was doing. He started to question her control. He'd tell Ed things like, "Mother isn't always right," and "We need to have our own lives." Henry was Ed's only normal relationship, the only person in Ed's entire world who treated him like a regular human being, the only person who suggested that maybe, just maybe, their mother's beliefs were extreme. Henry tried to free Ed. He really did. But we'll come back to Henry in a moment. Let me tell you about a specific incident that shows how Augusta operated. One day at school, when Ed was about 12 years old, a girl smiled at him. Just smiled. A normal, friendly childhood interaction. Ed smiled back. And maybe for just a moment, he felt something normal. Something warm. Something human. A classmate told Augusta. And when Ed got home that day, Augusta beat him. She screamed at him about sin and temptation. She made him read Bible passages about prostitutes for hours. She told him that girl was trying to drag him to hell. This happened every single time Ed showed any interest in normal childhood activities. any interest in friends, any interest in girls, any interest in anything outside of Augusta's control. Ed's school years were torture. At home, he had an abusive, controlling mother. At school, he was bullied mercilessly. The other children noticed Ed was different. He had effeminate mannerisms. He was shy. He was awkward. He didn't know how to play or joke or interact normally. So they bullied him. They called him names. They excluded him from games. They mocked him constantly. And Ed had no tools to handle this. Augusta had never taught him social skills. She'd never taught him how to stand up for himself. She'd never taught him that he had value. So Ed would run home crying after every incident. And where did he run? Straight to his mother. The same person who was destroying him became his only source of comfort. This is how abusive relationships work. The abuser creates the wound, then becomes the only bandage. By the time Ed reached his teenage years, he had completely withdrawn from social life. He stopped trying to make friends. He stopped trying to fit in. He went to school, came home, did his chores, and sat through Bible readings. His mother became his only female contact, the only woman he spoke to, the only woman he saw regularly. And remember, this is the woman who told him every single day that women are evil, sinful, and dangerous. Ed's entire understanding of women came from Augusta. He had no other reference point, no other examples, no other experiences. In 1940, George Gein died. He was 66 years old. Years of alcoholism had destroyed his body. And when he died, Ed was 34 years old. Still living at home, still sleeping in his mother's bedroom, still completely under her control. George's death changed the household dynamic. Now it was just Augusta, Henry, and Ed on that isolated farm. And Augusta's control over Ed intensified. With George gone, she focused all her attention on her sons, especially Ed. Now we come to May 16, 1944. This is one of the most important and disturbing days in Ed's life. Ed and Henry were clearing brush on their property. They were burning vegetation, which was normal farm work. But somehow, a fire got out of control. Ed ran to town to get help. When firefighters arrived, Ed led them directly to Henry's body. Henry was dead, lying face down in an area that hadn't even burned. The police asked Ed what happened. His story didn't make sense. He said he lost sight of Henry in the smoke, but then how did he know exactly where to find the body? Henry's body showed bruises on the head, but the death was ruled asphyxiation from smoke. No investigation, no autopsy, no questions. Henry was buried and life went on. Here's what we know now. In the months before his death, Henry had been openly criticizing Augusta. He'd been telling Ed that their mother was controlling them, that her beliefs were wrong, that they needed to break free. Henry was 43 years old. He was finally ready to leave. And he was trying to take Ed with him. He was the only person who ever tried to free Ed from Augusta's grip. And then, suddenly, Henry was dead, under suspicious circumstances, with Ed as the only witness. Did Ed kill his brother? We'll never know for certain, but psychologists believe that if he did, it wasn't really Ed making that choice. It was Augusta's voice in his head. Henry was threatening the only relationship Ed had ever known. He was threatening Ed's entire identity. After Henry died, there was no one left to challenge Augusta's absolute control. No one to tell Ed that his mother was wrong. No one to offer him an alternative way of thinking. No one to help him escape. For the next year, it was just Ed and Augusta, alone on that farm. And her control over him became total and complete. He was 38 years old, and he had never kissed a girl, never been on a date, never had a friend, never lived a single day as an independent person. Everything I've just told you, the isolation, the abuse, the twisted beliefs about women, the complete lack of identity, all of this was building towards something. Augusta had created a psychological time bomb, and in 1945, that bomb was about to go off. Because in 1945, Augusta Gein had a stroke, and everything Ed had ever known was about to collapse. In 1945, Augusta Gein had a stroke. She was 67 years old, and suddenly this powerful, controlling woman was helpless. She couldn't walk without assistance. She couldn't care for herself. She needed constant help with everything. And who became her full-time caretaker? Ed. At 39 years old, Ed finally had a role his mother valued. He fed her. He bathed her. He dressed her. He moved her from bed to chair. He stayed by her side every single moment. Their bond, which was already unhealthy, became even more intense during these months. For Ed, this was almost a happy time. His mother needed him. She depended on him. For the first time in his life, he felt necessary. He felt important. He felt loved in the only twisted way he understood love. On December 29, 1945, Augusta Gein died. She had a second stroke, and this time it killed her. Ed was with her when she died. He watched the only person who had ever mattered to him take her last breath. And in that moment, Ed Gein's entire world collapsed. Everything he was, everything he knew, everything he believed, all of it was tied to his mother. And now she was gone. Imagine spending 39 years with only one person defining your reality. One voice in your head, one source of all meaning. And then that person disappears. What's left? Who are you? Ed had no answer to these questions, because Ed Gein had never existed as a separate person. Ed couldn't accept that his mother was dead, so he did something that made sense to his broken mind. He sealed off her bedroom completely. He sealed off the living room where she used to sit and read the Bible to him. He left everything exactly as she had it. Her clothes stayed in the closet. Her books stayed on the shelves. Her furniture stayed in exactly the same positions. Her reading glasses stayed on the side table. Nothing was moved. Nothing was touched. Nothing was cleaned. These rooms became shrines to Augusta Gein. Ed lived in the remaining small spaces of the farmhouse. The kitchen. One small bedroom. That was it. The rest of the house belonged to his mother's memory. And in Ed's mind, she was still there, still watching, still judging, still controlling. But preserving her rooms wasn't enough. Ed needed more. He needed his mother back. And in 1947, about 2 years after her death, Ed went to a local cemetery at night. He dug up a grave. The grave of a middle-aged woman who had recently been buried. A woman who looked like Augusta. He brought the body back to his farmhouse, and this began a pattern that would continue for years. Between 1947 and 1954, Ed robbed multiple graves. Always women, always middle-aged, always resembling his mother. And what did he do with these bodies? He created what psychologists later called a woman's suit. He was literally trying to become his mother. He would wear the skin. He would put on the face masks. He would transform himself into Augusta. For 7 years, grave robbery was enough. But then something changed. Maybe the bodies were too decomposed. Maybe the psychological need intensified. Maybe the line between dead women and living women blurred in his mind. On December 8, 1954, Ed walked into a tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin. The owner was Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old woman. And Mary Hogan looked like Augusta Gein. Ed shot her. He took her body back to his farmhouse. Mary Hogan became part of his collection. And this time, the body was fresh. This time, it was exactly what he needed. 3 years later, on November 16, 1957, Ed walked into Warden's hardware store in Plainfield. The owner was Bernice Warden, a 58-year-old woman. And Bernice Warden looked like Augusta Gein. Ed shot her with a rifle from her own store. He loaded her body into his truck. He took her back to his farmhouse, and when police found her body, she was hanging in his shed, dressed like a deer carcass. Here's what you need to understand. Every victim Ed chose, every grave he robbed, every piece of human skin he preserved, every mask he created, every bowl he crafted, every piece of furniture he made, they all had one thing in common. They looked like Augusta. Ed wasn't killing random women. He wasn't robbing random graves. He was trying to recreate his mother. He was trying to bring her back. He was trying to become her. And when he couldn't do that with dead bodies anymore, he started killing living women who reminded him of her. Augusta Gein died in 1945. But her voice never left Ed's head. Her beliefs never left his mind. Her control never ended. She destroyed him so completely that even 12 years after her death, she was still making him kill. This is the direct line from childhood trauma to horrific crimes. This is how a mother's systematic abuse creates a killer. And this is why Ed Gein's story matters. Now we need to talk about the psychology behind all of this. Because what happened to Ed Gein wasn't just abuse. It was systematic psychological destruction. And understanding how this works is crucial to understanding why Ed became what he became. Let's start with something called attachment disorder. When babies are born, they form bonds with their caregivers, usually their mother. This bond is supposed to be healthy. It's supposed to teach the child that the world is safe, that people can be trusted, and that they have value as a person. But Augusta didn't create a healthy bond with Ed. She created what psychologists call an anxious, ambivalent attachment. This means Ed was constantly anxious about his mother's approval. He never knew if she would be loving or cruel. He never felt secure. And most importantly, he learned that he couldn't function without her. Think about it this way. Most children learn to be independent. They learn to make decisions. They learn to trust their own judgment. Ed never learned any of this. Every thought he had, every feeling he experienced, every decision he made, all of it had to go through his mother first. By the time Ed was an adult, he literally couldn't function as a separate person. His mother wasn't just important to him. She was his entire identity. She was the voice in his head. She was his conscience. She was his reality. Now let's talk about something Sigmund Freud identified over 100 years ago. It's called psychosexual development. And before you think this sounds too complicated, let me explain it simply. Freud said the children go through stages of development. One of these stages happens around age 5 or 6. It's called the Oedipal stage. During this stage, boys develop strong feelings for their mothers. But in healthy families, boys eventually move past this stage. They develop normal relationships with other people. They develop normal sexual identities. Ed Gein never moved past this stage. Augusta made sure of it. She kept Ed emotionally attached to her in a way that prevented him from ever developing normal feelings about women or sexuality. Ed was stuck. Frozen. At 39 years old, he had the psychosexual development of a 5-year-old child. He couldn't process female sexuality. He couldn't understand female autonomy. He couldn't see women as real, complex human beings. This brings us to Ed's mother fixation, and this is where things get really disturbing. Because of Augusta's constant preaching, Ed could only see women in 2 ways. Either they were evil sinners like Augusta said all women were, or they were saints like Augusta believed she was. There was no middle ground, no normal women, no women who were just regular people with good qualities and bad qualities. In Ed's mind, you were either a prostitute destined for hell, or you were a pure, godly woman like his mother. And here's the critical part. When Ed looked at his victims, he didn't see them as they really were. Mary Hogan was a tavern owner. Bernice Warden was a hardware store owner. They were independent, working women living their own lives. But Ed didn't see that. He saw his mother. Every single victim he chose resembled Augusta in age, build, and appearance. He wasn't killing random women. He was trying to recreate his mother. He was trying to bring her back. Now we need to talk about the woman suit. And I know this sounds like something from a horror movie, but understanding why Ed created this is crucial to understanding his psychology. Ed wasn't just collecting body parts. He was trying to literally become his mother. He would wear the skin. He would put on the face masks. He would dress in women's clothing made from human skin. And in those moments, in his broken mind, he was Augusta. Think about what this means psychologically. Ed's identity was so completely destroyed that the only way he could feel whole was to physically transform into his mother. He couldn't exist as Ed Gein. That person had never been allowed to develop, so he became Augusta instead. Psychologists call this identification with the aggressor. When someone is abused so severely, sometimes they cope by becoming the abuser. They take on the abuser's identity because it feels safer than being the victim. Ed took this to the most extreme level imaginable. Here's something that even the media got wrong at the time. People assumed Ed was sexually attracted to corpses, that he was a necrophiliac. But psychologists who evaluated Ed said that wasn't accurate. Ed wasn't sexually attracted to dead bodies. He was trying to resurrect mother figures. He was trying to preserve them. He was trying to keep them with him, the way he had kept his mother's rooms preserved. Remember, Ed had no normal understanding of sexuality. Augusta had destroyed that part of his development. What Ed was doing with these bodies wasn't sexual in the way most people understand sexuality. It was about preservation, about keeping his mother alive, about never being alone again. When police found the bodies and body parts in Ed's farmhouse, they were shocked by how carefully everything was preserved. Ed had tanned the skin like leather. He had treated it with care. He had created functional items, lampshades, bowls, furniture. This wasn't the work of someone in a sexual frenzy. This was the work of someone trying to preserve something precious. When Ed was arrested, psychiatrists diagnosed him with schizophrenia. This is a serious mental illness where people lose touch with reality. They hear voices. They see things that aren't there. They believe things that aren't true. But here's what's important to understand. Ed's schizophrenia didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't just random brain chemistry. It was rooted in 39 years of isolation and psychological conditioning. For 39 years, Ed lived in a reality that only existed in Augusta's mind. A reality where all women were evil, where sex was the ultimate sin, where his mother was the only good person in the world. And Ed had no other input, no other perspectives, no other voices telling him this wasn't normal. When Augusta died, Ed's grip on reality completely shattered. The voice in his head didn't stop. Augusta's beliefs didn't disappear. They intensified. And without any social connections or normal relationships to ground him, Ed slipped further and further into delusion. By the time he committed his murders, Ed genuinely believed he was doing something meaningful. He believed he was bringing his mother back. He believed these women wanted to be with him. He believed his actions made sense. This is what complete psychological destruction looks like. Now let's talk about what Netflix's show got wrong. And to be fair, the show was entertaining. It had good production value. It told a compelling story. But it missed the depth of what actually happened. The Netflix show focused heavily on the crimes themselves, the investigation, the discovery of the bodies, the shock value of what police found in Ed's farmhouse. And yes, those things are important. They're part of the story. But the show skipped over the daily psychological torture that created Ed Gein. They showed Augusta as strict and religious, but they didn't show the hours of forced Bible readings. They didn't show the complete social isolation. They didn't show the bedroom sharing that continued into Ed's 30s. The show didn't explain why Ed chose his specific victims. They didn't explain that every single woman he killed or exhumed looked like Augusta. They didn't explain the mother resurrection psychology that drove everything he did. And most importantly, the show didn't help viewers understand that Ed Gein wasn't born a monster. He was created. Systematically. Deliberately. Over 39 years of abuse.
Psychologists who evaluated Ed after his arrest said something that should make all of us think. They said Augusta didn't just abuse her son. She systematically destroyed his ability to form normal human relationships or develop a normal sexual identity. Dr. Edward Schubert, one of the psychiatrists who examined Ed, said that Ed had never developed beyond childhood emotionally. At 51 years old, Ed had the emotional maturity of a young child. He couldn't understand complex emotions. He couldn't process normal social interactions. He couldn't function independently. Another expert noted that Ed showed no signs of sadism. He didn't enjoy causing pain. He didn't torture his victims. His murders were quick, almost mechanical. Because in Ed's mind, he wasn't really killing people. He was collecting materials. He was gathering what he needed to resurrect his mother. The women he killed weren't real people to him. They were vessels. They were pieces of Augusta that he could preserve and keep forever. This is a critical distinction. Serial killers like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy enjoyed the act of killing. They got pleasure from the power and control. They tortured their victims. They prolonged the suffering. Ed Gein was different. He was operating in a completely detached psychological state. When he shot Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, he did it quickly and efficiently. He wasn't savoring the moment. He wasn't enjoying their fear. He was simply obtaining what he needed. Another expert noted that Ed showed no signs of sadism. He didn't enjoy causing pain. He didn't torture his victims. His murders were quick, almost mechanical. Because in Ed's mind, he wasn't really killing people. He was collecting materials. He was gathering what he needed to resurrect his mother. The women he killed weren't real people to him. They were vessels. They were pieces of Augusta that he could preserve and keep forever. This is a critical distinction. Serial killers like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy enjoyed the act of killing. They got pleasure from the power and control. They tortured their victims. They prolonged the suffering. Ed Gein was different. He was operating in a completely detached psychological state. When he shot Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, he did it quickly and efficiently. He wasn't savoring the moment. He wasn't enjoying their fear. He was simply obtaining what he needed. Here's the uncomfortable truth that we need to acknowledge. Ed Gein was both a victim and a perpetrator. He committed horrific crimes. He took innocent lives. He caused unimaginable trauma to families and communities. Nothing excuses that. But Ed was also a victim of severe, prolonged child abuse. He was a victim of psychological torture that lasted his entire life. He never had a chance to become a normal person. He never had a chance to develop healthy relationships. He never had a chance to understand the world in a normal way. If Ed had been removed from Augusta's care as a child, would any of this have happened? If someone had intervened when Ed was 10, or 15, or even 25 years old, could he have been saved? We'll never know. But the psychological evidence suggests that Ed's crimes were entirely preventable. Today, we understand child abuse and its long-term effects much better than people did in the 1940s and 1950s. We know that severe childhood trauma literally changes brain development. We know that isolation and psychological abuse can create permanent damage. We know that children who are raised in extreme environments can lose touch with reality. If Ed Gein were a child today, and if someone reported what Augusta was doing, Child Protective Services would intervene. Ed would be removed from the home. He would receive therapy. He would have a chance at normal development. But Ed was born in 1906. He grew up in rural Wisconsin, where families were private and no one interfered. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was far too late. The damage was complete. The monster had been created. This is why Ed Gein's story matters. Not because of the shocking crimes, not because of the horror movie inspiration, but because it shows us exactly how child abuse creates killers. It shows us the direct line from maternal psychological torture to murder. And it shows us why early intervention in abusive homes is so critically important. Ed Gein didn't choose to become what he became. That choice was made for him by his mother, every single day of his childhood, until there was nothing left of Ed, except Augusta's voice in his head. So let's bring this all together, because after everything we've covered, there's one truth that stands above all the others. Augusta Gein didn't just influence her son's crimes. She didn't just contribute to his problems. She didn't just make things worse. Augusta Gein engineered Ed's entire pathology. She created it, deliberately. Through decades of isolation, religious extremism, and systematic psychological abuse, every single element of Ed's crimes can be traced directly back to something Augusta did. The victim selection? Augusta taught him all women were evil except her. The grave robberies? Augusta made herself the center of his entire existence. The woman suit? Augusta destroyed his identity so completely that he could only exist by becoming her. The murders?
Augusta's voice never left his head, even 12 years after her death. This wasn't influence. This was creation. Augusta Gein built a killer, piece by piece, day by day, for 39 years. Ed Gein's case teaches us several critical lessons that extend far beyond one disturbed man in rural Wisconsin. First, extreme religious control combined with isolation creates a developmental catastrophe. Religion itself isn't the problem. Millions of people grow up in religious homes and become healthy, well-adjusted adults. But when religion is used as a weapon to control, to isolate, and to destroy a child's sense of self, it becomes incredibly dangerous.
Augusta used the Bible to tell Ed that he was worthless, that all women were evil, that sex was the ultimate sin, that the outside world was corrupt, and because Ed had no other input, no other perspectives, no other voices, he believed every word. This combination of extreme religious messaging and complete social isolation destroyed any chance Ed had at normal development. Second, parental psychological abuse can be just as destructive as physical abuse, maybe even more destructive. If Augusta had beaten Ed with a belt, people would have seen the bruises. Someone might have intervened. But psychological abuse leaves no visible marks. No one could see what Augusta was doing to Ed's mind. No one could see how she was systematically destroying his ability to function as a normal human being. We now understand that emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, and enforced isolation can cause permanent damage to a child's brain development. These aren't just bad parenting or being too strict. These are forms of severe abuse that can create lasting psychological disorders. Third, Ed Gein's case fundamentally changed how forensic psychology views mother-son dynamics. Before Ed, most criminal psychology focused on absent fathers or physical abuse. Ed's case showed that an overly present, controlling mother could be just as damaging. It showed that enmeshment, when a parent refuses to let a child develop as a separate person, could create severe pathology. After Ed Gein, psychologists started paying much more attention to cases of extreme maternal control. They started recognizing the warning signs. They started understanding that some of the most dangerous psychological damage happens in homes that look normal from the outside. This brings us to an uncomfortable ethical question, and I want you to really think about this. When childhood systematically destroys normal development, where does accountability begin? Ed Gein was absolutely a killer. He murdered 2 women. He robbed graves. He created horrific items from human remains. He caused unimaginable trauma and pain. He deserved to be held accountable for those actions. But Augusta Gein created the killer. She destroyed Ed's ability to function normally. She isolated him from any chance at healthy development. She filled his head with beliefs that made it impossible for him to see women as real people. She made herself so central to his existence that he couldn't survive without her. So where does the responsibility lie? With the man who committed the crimes, or with the mother who spent 39 years creating a person incapable of understanding right from wrong? There's no easy answer. Ed still made choices. He still pulled the trigger. He still took lives. But were those really choices in any meaningful sense? Or were they the inevitable result of decades of psychological programming? This is the question that Ed Gein's case forces us to confront. And it's a question that still matters today. Because here's the thing. Cases like Ed Gein taught us something crucial. Monsters aren't born. They're made. One traumatic day at a time.
one instance of abuse at a time, one moment of isolation at a time. We now know that severe childhood trauma can be prevented. We now know that early intervention can save children from becoming the next Ed Gein. We now know that psychological abuse is just as serious as physical abuse and needs to be treated that way. Ed Gein's story is a tragedy on multiple levels. It's a tragedy for his victims and their families. It's a tragedy for the community of Plainfield. And in a different way, it's a tragedy for Ed himself, a child who never had a chance to become a healthy adult. But if we learn from this tragedy, if we use it to recognize and prevent child abuse, if we intervene when we see children being isolated and psychologically destroyed, then maybe some good can come from this horror. If you want more deep psychological analysis of true crime cases like this, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell notification, because we're not just telling you what happened, we're showing you why it happened. We're going deeper than Netflix. We're giving you the psychological truth behind the crimes. In the next video, we're covering another case where childhood trauma created a killer. And I promise you, it's going to be just as eye-opening as this one. What case should we analyze next? What killer's childhood do you want us to investigate? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if this video gave you a new perspective on Ed Gein, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves true crime psychology. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.